The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of JFK International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Dr. Aiden Chen stood patiently in the security line, his mind still buzzing from the incredible medical conference he'd attended in Paris. As one of the country's top brain surgeons, he'd spent the past week sharing his latest surgical techniques with doctors from around the world. The security line moved slowly, filled with tired travelers clutching their coffee cups and dragging their wheeled suitcases. Dr. Chen checked his watch. He had 2 hours until his connecting flight to Boston, where a young patient was waiting for him. Tomorrow morning, he was scheduled to perform a delicate operation that could change the 12-year-old's life forever. Next, called the TSA agent, and Dr. Chen stepped forward. He carefully placed his expensive leather briefcase on the conveyor belt, along with his laptop and shoes. The briefcase was a gift from his hospital team after he completed his 1,000th successful surgery. Inside were important medical documents and surgical plans he'd been working on during his flight from Paris. As he walked through the metal detector, Dr. Chen couldn't help but smile, thinking about the breakthrough discussion he'd had with his colleagues in Paris. They had found a new way to treat certain types of brain tumors that could help thousands of patients. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice when the security scanner beeped at the person behind him. The line paused as Dr. Chen reached the other side of the security checkpoint. He waited patiently for his belongings to come through on the conveyor belt. His briefcase appeared first, and he reached for it just as a loud voice cut through the normal airport noise. "Hey, that's my laptop bag," someone shouted from behind him. Dr. Chen turned around, briefcase in hand, to see a well-dressed businessman pointing at him. The man's face was red with anger. "Security, this man has my bag." The busy security area suddenly became quiet. Dozens of eyes turned to stare at Dr. Chen, who stood there confused. He looked down at the briefcase in his hands. The same briefcase he'd carried for the past 3 years, the one with his name tag clearly attached to the handle. "Sir, I believe there's been a mistake," Dr. Chen said calmly, even as his heart began to race. "This is my briefcase. I've had it for years." He turned the bag to show the name tag, but the businessman was already waving over security officers. 2 TSA agents approached quickly, their faces serious. More travelers had stopped to watch now, and Dr. Chen could see several people pulling out their phones to record. Some whispered to each other, while others shook their heads. He could feel the weight of their judgments, their assumptions, pressing down on him like a physical force. "Sir, we need you to step aside," one of the officers said firmly. Dr. Chen nodded, maintaining his professional composure despite the humiliation burning in his chest. He could hear someone in the crowd mutter something about these people always causing trouble, and another person replied with a harsh laugh. The businessman continued to point and shout, drawing even more attention. "Check his bag. I know that's mine. I have important work documents in there." His voice echoed through the security area, making other travelers crane their necks to see what was happening. Dr. Chen took a deep breath, remembering the countless times he'd handled high-pressure situations in the operating room. But this was different. In the awe, people respected him, trusted him. Here, in this moment, none of his achievements mattered. They didn't see a doctor who'd saved hundreds of lives. They saw only what they wanted to see. As more security officers gathered around him, Dr. Chen realized with a sinking feeling that this incident was about to become much bigger than a simple misunderstanding about a briefcase. He could see it in the way the officers positioned themselves, in the suspicious glances from passing travelers, in the phones raised to record his every move. The morning sun that had seemed so bright and promising just minutes ago now felt harsh and exposing. His connecting flight to Boston, his young patient waiting for surgery, his groundbreaking research from Paris. All of it was about to be put on hold because someone had made a snap judgment about him based on nothing but appearance. Little did anyone know that this moment, this painful and humiliating moment, would soon unfold into something none of them expected. The truth about Dr. Chen's identity was about to stun everyone in that airport, and the events that followed would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond these walls. The security checkpoint area had transformed into an impromptu theater, with Dr. Chen unwillingly cast as the main character in an unfolding drama. 4 TSA officers now surrounded him, their blue uniforms creating a wall between him and the growing crowd of onlookers. The businessman who had accused him continued to gesture wildly, his voice getting louder with each passing moment. "I want to show you something," Dr. Chen said quietly, reaching slowly into his pocket. One of the officers tensed up immediately. "It's just my ID," he explained, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. He'd been in America for 20 years, become one of the country's leading neurosurgeons, and yet here he was, having to prove he wasn't a thief. He carefully pulled out his hospital identification card, complete with his photo and credentials. "I'm a neurosurgeon at Boston General. This briefcase contains medical documents for a surgery I'm scheduled to perform tomorrow morning." The words came out clear and professional, just like when he explained complicated procedures to his patients' families. The businessman scoffed loudly. "Anyone can fake an ID these days." His words carried across the security area, encouraging more phones to point in their direction. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Just check the bag already," followed by murmurs of agreement. A young TSA officer, whose name tag read Officer Rodriguez, stepped forward. "Sir, please come with us to the private screening area." His tone was professional but firm. Dr. Chen nodded, knowing that cooperation was his best option, even as frustration and hurt churned inside him. As they walked toward the glass-walled room, he could hear snippets of conversation from the crowd. "Can you believe this? I'd always keep my laptop close in these situations. You never know these days." Each comment felt like a small cut, death by 1,000 paper cuts of prejudice. Inside the private room, Dr. Chen placed his briefcase on the steel table. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everything feel stark and clinical, so different from his operating room where he was respected, where his word was trusted without question. "Sir, can you open the briefcase?" Officer Rodriguez asked. The businessman had been brought in as well, standing near the door with his arms crossed, looking triumphant. Dr. Chen unlatched the worn leather catches, ones his fingers had opened thousands of times before. Inside, neatly organized, were his surgical plans, medical journals, and the notes from the Paris conference. A small photo was tucked into the inner pocket, his parents at his medical school graduation, their faces beaming with pride. How far he'd come from that day, and yet. "These are all medical documents," Officer Rodriguez said, carefully examining the papers. Another officer was already reviewing the security camera footage on a small monitor in the corner. The businessman's confidence began to waver slightly. Dr. Chen pulled up his phone and opened his email. "Here's my flight confirmation from Paris and my connecting flight to Boston. Here's also the hospital's surgery schedule for tomorrow morning." He showed them the screen, his voice still calm but tinged with wariness. The businessman stepped closer, his face reddening for a different reason now. "But I saw him take a bag that looked exactly like mine." His voice trailed off as doubt crept in. A knock on the glass door interrupted them. Another TSA agent entered, looking slightly out of breath. "Sir," she addressed her colleague, "we found another passenger with a similar briefcase at gate 23. They're bringing him back now." The air in the room shifted. The businessman's face fell as realization dawned. Dr. Chen stood there, still surrounded by his scattered medical documents, feeling a complex mix of emotions: relief, frustration, lingering anger, and a deep sadness that this situation had happened at all. Outside the glass walls, people were still watching, still recording. Some had been there the whole time, waiting to see how this would play out. Dr. Chen could see them sharing videos, probably uploading them to social media already. His private humiliation would soon become public entertainment. Officer Rodriguez started gathering the medical documents, handling them with newfound respect. "Dr. Chen, we apologize for the inconvenience. We'll help you get to your gate as quickly as possible." His words were sincere, but they couldn't erase what had just happened. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, looking everywhere except at Dr. Chen. The reality of his actions was setting in, along with the knowledge that his face, too, would be all over social media by evening. His unfounded accusation, his angry outburst, his rush to judgment, all captured and ready to be shared with the world. Dr. Chen carefully repacked his briefcase, making sure each document was in its proper place. His hands moved automatically, performing this familiar task while his mind raced ahead to what would come next. His young patient in Boston, the surgery tomorrow, the face he would need to put on for the hospital staff who would surely hear about this incident. As he closed the briefcase, he caught his reflection in the glass wall, still standing straight, still dignified, despite everything. The small name tag on his briefcase caught the light, the engraved letters spelling out not just a name, but an identity that should have been enough from the very beginning. The incident was ending, but its effects were just beginning to ripple outward. What happened next would surprise everyone involved, transforming a moment of prejudice into something unexpected and powerful. But for now, Dr. Chen just wanted to make his flight, reach Boston, and do what he did best: save lives, regardless of who believed in him and who didn't. The small security office buzzed with activity as Officer Rodriguez and his team worked to sort out the situation. The wall of monitors showed different angles of the security checkpoint, rewinding and playing the same few minutes over and over. Dr. Chen sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching his connecting flight time tick closer on the wall clock above. "I need to make a call," he said, pulling out his phone. "My surgical team in Boston needs to know I might be delayed." His voice remained professional, but there was an edge of worry in it now. The young patient's face flashed in his mind. A 12-year-old boy who'd been waiting months for this operation. Officer Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. "Of course, sir. Please go ahead." The change in how they addressed him was subtle but noticeable. Gone was the suspicious tone, replaced by something close to respect, maybe even a hint of embarrassment. Dr. Chen stepped to the corner of the room and dialed his head nurse. "Lisa." "Yes, it's Dr. Chen." "I'm still at JFK. There's been a situation." He explained briefly, trying to keep his voice low, but in the small room, everyone could hear his side of the conversation. "The patient's family needs to be notified that there might be a delay." "No, I'm still planning to perform the surgery, even if I have to work through the night to review everything." Meanwhile, another officer was methodically going through security footage. The images showed the busy morning rush at the checkpoint. There was Dr. Chen, placing his briefcase on the conveyor belt. 3 people later, the businessman did the same with an identical leather bag. The footage continued, showing someone else, a man in a gray suit, grabbing a briefcase and hurrying away. "There," pointed one of the officers. "That's our guy. He took the wrong bag and left the area." They zoomed in on the man's face, already coordinating with other security teams to locate him. The businessman, who had been watching the footage with growing discomfort, sank deeper into his chair. His earlier righteous anger had dissolved into visible shame. He kept opening his mouth as if to say something, then closing it again, unable to find the right words. Dr. Chen finished his call and sat back down, checking his watch again. He'd missed his original flight, and the next one wasn't for another 3 hours. The surgery schedule would need to be completely reworked. Years of training helped him maintain his composure, but inside, he was calculating every minute, every potential complication this delay could cause. A gentle knock on the door interrupted the tense silence. A tall officer in a different uniform entered, his face lighting up with recognition as soon as he saw Dr. Chen. "Oh my God," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Dr. Chen? From Boston General?" Everyone in the room turned to look at the new arrival. Officer Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You know him, Chief Wallace?" The chief's face broke into a warm smile. "Know him? This man saved my nephew's life last year. Tommy had a tumor that nobody else would even try to operate on. Dr. Chen spent 16 hours in surgery and got it all out. Tommy just started college this fall." The room fell completely silent. The businessman seemed to shrink even further into his chair. On the security monitors, the footage continued to play silently, showing the morning's events from every angle. A dance of misconceptions and rushed judgments captured in endless loop. Chief Wallace turned to Dr. Chen, genuine concern on his face. "What happened here? Why are you being detained?" Before anyone could answer, another officer burst in. "We found him. The man with the wrong briefcase is at gate 23. He didn't even realize he had the wrong bag." Everything started moving quickly then. Officers rushed out to retrieve the missing briefcase. Chief Wallace began making calls, trying to get Dr. Chen on the next flight to Boston. The businessman finally found his voice, stumbling over words of apology that seemed inadequate in the face of everything that had happened. Through it all, Dr. Chen sat quietly, his own briefcase now safely in his lap. Inside were the surgical plans he'd refined during his flight from Paris, the new techniques he'd learned at the conference, the hopes of a 12-year-old boy and his family. All of it had almost been derailed by a simple assumption, a quick judgment, a moment of bias that could have had far-reaching consequences. The wall clock kept ticking, marking time in a room where time itself seemed to have shifted, from suspicion to revelation, from accusation to recognition. Outside, the airport continued its normal rhythm of arrivals and departures, most passengers unaware of the drama that had unfolded at the security checkpoint. But this story wasn't over. In fact, what happened next would transform this moment of injustice into something none of them could have predicted. The security footage, the witnesses' videos, the truth about Dr. Chen's identity, all of it was about to come together in a way that would reach far beyond the walls of JFK Airport, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would ripple out into the world. The security office was now crowded with people, all buzzing with a new kind of energy. Chief Wallace had pulled up a news article on his phone, showing everyone the feature story about Dr. Chen's groundbreaking surgery from last year. The same man they'd been treating as a suspect just hours ago was there on the screen, wearing surgical scrubs and explaining a revolutionary brain surgery technique he'd developed. "My nephew Tommy had been to 7 different hospitals," Chief Wallace was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "Every doctor said the same thing, the tumor was too risky to operate on. Then we found Dr. Chen." He turned to the businessman, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. This man spent 2 months planning that surgery. He worked with engineers to create special tools just for Tommy's case. Who does that? The businessman's briefcase had been retrieved from Gate 23, brought back by a flustered traveler in a gray suit who couldn't stop apologizing for the mix-up. "They really do look identical," the man said, placing the briefcase on the table next to Dr. Chen's. "I was in such a hurry to make my flight, I didn't even check the name tag." Officer Rodriguez was reviewing the final security footage, this time with different eyes. The screen showed Dr. Chen's calm demeanor throughout the entire ordeal, his dignified responses to the accusations, the way he'd maintained his composure even as phones recorded his humiliation. "Sir," he said, turning to Dr. Chen, "I can't begin to apologize enough for what you've been through." But Dr. Chen's attention was on his phone, where he'd just received a text from his surgical team in Boston. "The patient's family is worried," he said quietly. "They've been preparing for this surgery for months. Every day we wait, the tumor grows." His words hung in the air, a reminder that while they'd been sorting out this misunderstanding, real lives hung in the balance. Chief Wallace immediately sprang into action. "I'll handle this personally," he said, picking up his phone. Within minutes, he was talking to airline representatives, pulling strings he never pulled before. "This is about a child's life," they heard him say. "We need to get Dr. Chen to Boston as soon as possible." While this was happening, the videos taken by witnesses had already started spreading online. One of the younger officers looked up from his phone, his eyes wide. "Chief, this is going viral. The original video has over 50,000 views already, and people are sharing screenshots of Dr. Chen's medical achievements alongside it." The businessman, who had been silent for a while, finally stood up. His face was ashen, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I made a terrible mistake. I jumped to conclusions without any real reason, and I could have prevented a child from getting life-saving surgery because of my prejudice." Dr. Chen looked at him for a long moment. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for his response. When he spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. "Every day in surgery, I see what happens when people jump to conclusions too quickly. One wrong assumption, one hasty decision, and everything can go wrong. But I've also seen what happens when people admit their mistakes and learn from them. That's how we grow. That's how we get better." The businessman's eyes filled with tears. Behind him, Chief Wallace was ending his phone call with a triumphant smile. "There's a seat for you on the next flight to Boston, Dr. Chen. It leaves in 45 minutes. I'll personally escort you to the gate." As they gathered Dr. Chen's belongings, a new commotion arose outside the security office. A small crowd had gathered. Airport staff, fellow travelers, even some of the people who had recorded the earlier incident. Word had spread about who Dr. Chen was, about the young patient waiting for him in Boston, about Chief Wallace's nephew Tommy. Someone started clapping. Then another person joined in. Soon, the whole area was filled with applause. Dr. Chen stood in the doorway, briefcase in hand, somewhat embarrassed by the attention but moved by the complete transformation of the situation. A young girl pushed through the crowd, holding out her phone. "Dr. Chen," she said breathlessly, "my brother had brain surgery last year. The technique they used, it was the one you developed. He's back in school now, playing soccer again. Could I take a picture with you?" As Chief Wallace led him through the terminal, more people approached with similar stories. The same phones that had recorded his humiliation were now capturing a different kind of moment, one of recognition, respect, and redemption. The businessman followed quietly behind, witnessing the impact of his actions and the extraordinary character of the man he had wrongly accused. But there was no time for extended conversations or photo opportunities. A 12-year-old boy was waiting in Boston, and Dr. Chen still had a surgery to perform. As they rushed to the gate, the story of what had happened at JFK that morning continued to spread across social media, sparking conversations in homes, offices, and hospitals across the country. The incident that began with an accusation was about to become something much more significant, a catalyst for change, a moment of reflection, and a reminder that behind every hasty judgment, there might be a story capable of changing hearts and minds. But first, Dr. Chen had a plane to catch and a life to save. By evening, the incident at JFK Airport had taken on a life of its own. The original videos of Dr. Chen being accused of theft had spread across every social media platform, but they weren't telling the whole story anymore. People were sharing articles about his medical achievements alongside the footage, creating a powerful contrast that made everyone think twice about their own assumptions. In Boston, Dr. Chen had arrived just in time to review his surgical plans. The hospital hallways buzzed with whispers as he walked past, not because of his race this time, but because many had already seen the viral videos. Some staff members wanted to express their support, but they could see his focus was entirely on his young patient. Back at JFK, the businessman sat in a coffee shop, staring at his phone in disbelief. His face was all over social media, captured in those moments of angry accusation. His company's name had been identified, and people were leaving thousands of comments on their social media pages. But what caught his attention weren't the angry messages. Instead, it was a post from a mother whose child had been treated by Dr. Chen 3 years ago. "The man you accused of theft," she wrote, "spent Christmas Eve operating on my daughter when no other doctor would take the risk. He missed his own family dinner to save mine. Before you judge someone, remember that every person has a story you might not know." The post had been shared over 100,000 times in just a few hours. More stories began pouring in, patients and families whose lives Dr. Chen had touched over the years. Each one added another layer to the narrative, transforming a moment of prejudice into a powerful lesson about human dignity. Airport security footage was released, showing how the real mix-up had happened. People analyzed it frame by frame, pointing out how quick everyone had been to believe the worst. "Watch how nobody questioned the accusation," one viral tweet read. "Ask yourself why." Chief Wallace's nephew Tommy, now a college freshman, posted a video that quickly went viral. "When every other doctor gave up on me," he said, his voice steady and clear, "Dr. Chen spent hours explaining everything to my family. He didn't just save my life, he gave us hope when we had none." And today, someone tried to humiliate him because they couldn't believe he owned a nice briefcase. The businessman's written apology appeared on LinkedIn, where it sparked intense discussions about workplace bias. "I'm a senior executive who sat through countless diversity training sessions," he wrote. "I thought I understood prejudice, but today I almost prevented a child from receiving life-saving surgery because I couldn't see past my own biases. I didn't just judge a book by its cover, I nearly destroyed the story inside." News channels picked up the story, but they struggled to get comments from Dr. Chen. He was already in surgery, standing over his young patient's brain, his skilled hands moving with precision as he worked to remove the tumor. The same hands that had been forced to open his briefcase for inspection hours earlier were now carefully saving another life. In the airport security office, Officer Rodriguez was conducting a staff meeting. The videos playing on everyone's phones had made their routine job feel suddenly momentous. "We need to talk about what happened today," he said, looking at each of his colleagues. "Because somewhere in this airport right now, there's another Dr. Chen going through security. We just don't know it yet." The businessman's company issued a formal statement announcing mandatory bias training for all employees. But they went a step further. They reached out to hospitals and medical schools, offering to fund scholarships for minority students interested in becoming surgeons. "Today's incident opened our eyes," the statement read. "The best way to prevent such mistakes is to change the assumptions that caused them in the first place." Social media couldn't get enough of the story. Hashtags like #SeeTheWholeStory and #LookBeyondBS started trending. People began sharing their own experiences of being judged unfairly, creating a ripple effect of awareness and reflection. A group of medical students started an online campaign sharing photos of doctors from diverse backgrounds with the caption, "What does a doctor look like?" Their posts went viral, encouraging hospitals across the country to share similar messages. As evening turned to night, the initial airport videos were now being shared with a different purpose. Instead of capturing a moment of shame, they had become a teaching tool, a way to show how quickly prejudice can blind us to the humanity of others. In the hospital waiting room, the young patient's family huddled together, unaware of the social media storm their surgeon had endured just hours before. They only knew that Dr. Chen had arrived as promised, ready to perform the delicate operation their son desperately needed. To them, he wasn't a viral sensation or a symbol of social justice. He was simply the doctor they trusted with their child's life. The story was far from over, but something had shifted in those first 24 hours. What began as an all-too-familiar scene of prejudice had transformed into something unexpected, a moment of national reflection, a catalyst for change, and a reminder that behind every face lies a story worthy of being seen, heard, and respected. 3 days after the incident, Dr. Chen stood in front of a packed conference room at JFK Airport. The same security checkpoint where he'd been accused of theft was visible through the windows behind him. But today, he wasn't here as a traveler. He'd been invited to speak to airport security personnel about his experience. "First, I want to tell you about the surgery," he began, his voice calm and measured. "The young boy is recovering well. The tumor is gone, and he's already asking when he can play basketball again." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Many of the officers had been following the story, wondering about the outcome of the surgery that had made the incident so time-critical. The boy's recovery photos were displayed on the screen, bright, hopeful images that reminded everyone what had really been at stake that day. Chief Wallace sat in the front row, beaming with pride at his nephew's successful recovery photos displayed next to the recent patients. "But I'm not here to talk about medical successes," Dr. Chen continued. "I'm here to talk about what happened at that security checkpoint and why it matters to all of us." The room fell silent. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, especially those who had been present that day. Instead of anger or accusations, Dr. Chen shared stories. He talked about his first day of medical school, when a security guard had stopped him at the hospital entrance, assuming he was lost. He spoke about patients who had questioned his abilities based on his appearance, only to thank him later with tears in their eyes after successful surgeries. In the operating room, he explained, "We have a system called timeout. Before any surgery begins, the entire team stops and verifies everything: the patient's identity, the procedure, the surgical site. We do this because assumptions in medicine can be deadly. The same is true in security work." The businessman who had accused Dr. Chen was there too, invited as part of the training. He stood up and shared his perspective, his voice shaking slightly. "I had just come from a business meeting where I'd given a presentation about inclusion in the workplace," he admitted. "I thought I understood bias. But an hour later, I was shouting accusations based on nothing but my own prejudices." Dr. Chen pulled up screenshots of the social media response to the incident. "Look at these comments," he said. Thousands of people sharing similar experiences. But what's remarkable isn't the prejudice, it's what happened next. He showed videos of other incidents where bystanders had stepped in to stop unfair accusations. Security officers from other airports had started sharing their own stories of times they'd caught themselves making assumptions and how they'd learned to do better. The easiest response would have been anger, Dr. Chen continued. I could have filed complaints, demanded firings, launched lawsuits. But would that have changed anything? Would it have helped the next person who looks like me going through security? Officer Rodriguez, who had been promoted to lead the new training program, stood up. We've completely revised our protocols, he announced. Every officer now goes through enhanced bias awareness training. We've installed new signs reminding both staff and travelers to verify before accusing. But most importantly, we're changing the culture. The changes were already visible at the checkpoint outside. New displays showed faces of different travelers, doctors, professors, business leaders, artists, with their stories. Look closer, the signs read. Every traveler has a story. Dr. Chen shared messages he'd received from young medical students of color, telling him how his response to the incident had inspired them. One student wrote to me saying she'd been ready to quit medical school after facing constant prejudice, he said. But after seeing how this story unfolded, she decided to stay. That's why I'm here today. The businessman's company had taken things further. They'd established a foundation to support minority medical students, naming it after Dr. Chen despite his humble protests. The best way to fight prejudice, the businessman said, is to change the pictures in people's heads about who can be what. Toward the end of the session, a young security officer raised her hand. How do you let go of the anger? She asked. How do you turn something so unfair into something positive? Dr. Chen thought for a moment before answering. In surgery, we sometimes encounter unexpected problems. We can either freeze up and panic, or we can see it as a challenge to overcome, a chance to develop new solutions. Life gives us the same choice when we face injustice. The training session was being recorded, set to become part of standard security training across airports nationwide. But its impact went beyond security protocols. Other industries started reaching out, asking Dr. Chen to share his story and help develop their own bias training programs. As the session ended, Chief Wallace's nephew Tommy made a surprise appearance. The college freshman had flown in specially to thank Dr. Chen again and share his own story with the security teams. Standing there together, the doctor, the patient, the security chief, and the businessman, they represented a full circle of how prejudice could be transformed into progress. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit your idea of who they should be, Dr. Chen concluded, remember this story. Remember that the person you're looking at might be on their way to save a life, make a discovery, or change the world. Your job is important, but so is seeing the whole person in front of you. 1 year after the incident at JFK Airport, the impact of that day continued to ripple through society in unexpected ways. The security checkpoint where it all began had transformed. Gone were the stark warnings about unattended bags and prohibited items. Instead, the walls displayed a rotating gallery of photographs, everyday travelers whose stories challenged assumptions. Dr. Chen's young patient had not only recovered, but had become an unexpected ambassador for change. The 12-year-old boy, now 13 and back to playing basketball, had started a video blog about his recovery journey. His latest post showed him visiting medical schools with Dr. Chen, speaking to students about resilience and the importance of looking beyond appearances. My doctor didn't just fix my brain, the boy told a group of wide-eyed medical students. He showed me that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. His words, spoken with the simple wisdom of youth, had become something of a motto for the movement that grew from that day at the airport. The businessman had undergone his own transformation. Rather than trying to hide from his mistake, he'd become an outspoken advocate for conscious awareness and bias recognition in corporate America. His company's scholarship program had already helped 20 minority students start their medical training. I could have just written a check and considered it done, he explained in a recent interview. But that wouldn't have addressed the real issue. We needed to change the system that made my assumptions seem normal in the first place. The airport's new training program, developed with input from Dr. Chen, had spread to 50 other airports across the country. Security officers now went through regular sessions that combined practical security protocols with real-world scenarios about bias and assumption. The program had a simple name, Look Again. Chief Wallace's nephew Tommy had graduated college and started medical school, inspired by Dr. Chen's example. He created a student organization called Beyond First Glance that worked to increase diversity in medical programs. The group's first meeting had drawn hundreds of students from across the country. The original viral videos had evolved into a documentary series about hidden bias in everyday life. Each episode featured stories similar to Dr. Chen's, accomplished professionals who'd faced prejudice in ordinary situations. But instead of focusing on the negative encounters, the series highlighted the positive changes that followed. One morning, exactly 1 year after the incident, Dr. Chen returned to JFK for a special ceremony. The airport was unveiling a new training center dedicated to bias-free security practices. As he walked through the terminal, several travelers recognized him. But instead of pointing or whispering, they smiled and nodded with respect. The ceremony wasn't just about remembering what had happened. It was about celebrating what had changed. Representatives from airlines, airports, and security agencies gathered to announce new industry-wide standards for respectful screening procedures. The businessman was there too, standing proudly next to a display about the medical scholarship program. "Sometimes people ask me if I'm tired of talking about what happened that day," Dr. Chen said in his speech. "But this isn't just about one incident anymore. It's about all the small moments that happen every day, all the assumptions we make without thinking, and all the opportunities we have to choose a different response." He shared stories from the hundreds of letters he'd received over the past year. A young doctor wrote about how the incident had given her courage to speak up about discrimination in her hospital. A security officer described how the training program had helped him reconnect with his own biases and change how he approached his work. The most powerful moment came when Dr. Chen introduced his latest patient, a young girl who'd been inspired by his story to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor despite facing prejudice at school. She stood beside him at the podium, her recent brain surgery scar partly visible beneath her hair, and spoke about courage and determination. "Dr. Chen taught me that we can't always control how people see us," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But we can control how we respond. And sometimes, responding with kindness and understanding can change more minds than anger ever could." The airport had installed a simple plaque near the security checkpoint where it all began. It didn't mention names or point fingers. Instead, it read, "Look again. The person in front of you has a story you don't know, a journey you can't see, and gifts you might not imagine. Choose to see more." As the ceremony ended, Dr. Chen looked out at the crowd. He saw security officers standing next to medical students, airline executives chatting with civil rights activists, and everyday travelers stopping to listen and learn. The incident that could have ended in bitterness had instead sparked a movement of understanding and change. The businessman approached Dr. Chen one last time. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to worry that I'd always be remembered as the man who made that terrible accusation, but now I realize that's not the point. The point is what we choose to do after we recognize our mistakes." Dr. Chen smiled and reached out to shake his hand. In that moment, they weren't the accuser and the accused anymore. They were two people who had learned, grown, and helped others do the same. And in the end, that was the most powerful transformation of all.